Ole'Pops here. I got to thinking about walking Hagen today. I got to watching TV. Actually, Ole'Pop walks with a cane sometimes, and sometimes I don't. But when my knee gets to hurting me, my hip gets to hurting me too bad, I do. But I was watching TV, and they were showing this cane, this new kind of cane, where keeps you from, it stands a little taller than most canes. Keeps you from bending over so bad. And they wanted more money than what I wanted to pay for it, so I went and looked at all the canes that I had, and I put me together one, and it stands up kind of tall like a walking stick. And I went and took Hagen for a little walk with it, and it worked out just fine. And the thing about it is, on the very top of it, it's got a ball that I unscrew, and my camera will screw down on top of it like a mount. And that's going to come in handy as a shirt pocket. I think. Anyway, housekeeping. I'm smoking a Peterson Shannon from the very, very early 80s. Second pipe I ever owned. And inside, stuffed plumb full of it, is some Heartland Home caramel apple pie. It's one of the 5 ingredients that me and the Briar Dude puts in that special dessert mix we come up with. But I wanted to tell y'all a story today. 1979, when all my knee trouble, leg trouble, all of it, first started happening. In 1979, I worked for a company called Home Production Company. And I was a dock jockey. They'd back trucks up, and I'd unload them. We had trucks that come in, and I would unload, and we'd have work crews that go out and do a job, and I'd load them in the mornings. But they'd come in the afternoons, and I'd unload them. But it was a construction company, and one of the big jobs that we had contracted to do was it was a pretty big old home. It was what they'd call a mansion, but they were putting storm windows on it, and they had to have scaffolding and walkboards, and the scaffolding went inside the trailer of this truck, but the walkboards they'd tie across the top of the trailer and lash them down to the top of the cab. They had a platboard on top of the cab that went across, well, from the trailer, it kind of angled across the top of the cab, and we had to lash the walkboards across the top of the cab. Drinking coffee. I was sitting up on top of the cab, lashing the walkboards down. At the end of the day, after we'd unloaded the trailer, I was relashing the walkboards. And the driver of the truck had my leg hanging over the edge of the truck. And the driver of the truck lost his temper over something. I reckon he didn't see me up there and didn't see my leg hanging over the side of it, but he grabbed the edge of the door and he slammed that door. He slammed it so hard that the actual door shut, and it actually latched. And when it did, I fell forwards. And I'm standing there. I'm hanging there, looking at my own boot of my toe of my own boot, screaming loud. And when they finally got to me, I had passed out from the pain. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, in the emergency room in the hospital. That's where and when they figured out that most of the knee joint had been crushed. And they had to do some pretty extensive repair work on that joint. That was back in 1979. And I was way too young at the time for a knee replacement, and I don't know what the technology back then was, but they did not do a replacement. They just rebuilt some stuff and put pins and screws in it at the time. I want y'all to concentrate on three characters. One of them's name was Nurse Dietrich. She was about a 65-year-old nurse, and she had no bedside manner, none whatsoever. She was cold, this woman was. She was of German descent, and don't get me wrong, I have nothing against German people. My wife has got a lot of German in her. Bless her heart, I love them to death. But this woman was just cold. She was ice cold. She was cold as a cast iron toilet seat. And she walked hunched over. She was a big woman to begin with, but she walked hunched over, and she'd do like this when she walked. I mean, she walked like she was plowing a tough row of stumps. And anyway, second person I want you to concentrate on is an orderly. This guy played football for the school that I graduated, Riverdale High School. He played football for them he graduated 2 or 3 years before I did. His name was Malcolm Lester. He was a giant of a man. And this guy was all wool in a yard wide, let me tell you. He built like 20 pounds of concrete in a 10-pound poke. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He didn't know whether to scratch his watch or wind his butt. But he was a good-hearted fellow. He was a worker. He really was. The third fellow is a guy named Bob Latimer. Now, let me tell you something about Herbert Jones, my daddy. My daddy, I've already told y'all, worked for this university right here, MTSU. For 38 years he was a professor, but in his spare time he had a private tax practice. He represented many, many private individuals, and he represented many, many companies until his retirement. One of the private individuals that he represented was Mr. Bob Latimer. And one of the companies that he represented was Big Charlie's Bait Shop, owned by Mr. Bob Latimer. Now, Mr. Bob Latimer was a very, very fine man. Loved to laugh. He owned a farm. He had horses and mules on this farm. But he owned Big Charlie's Bait Shop. It was halfway between our hometown and a smaller town called Smyrna. And the Percy Priest Lake is in Smyrna. It's a pretty good sized lake. There's a lot of fishing. But we had an AM radio station, and at the time, a UHF television station in Murfreesboro. And there was a bluegrass family called the Stoneman family. And a lot of y'all may know who they are. They're pretty famous. They are legends. The Stoneman family. Ronnie Stoneman used to appear on a show called the Carl Tipton Show. And Carl Tipton resided in Murfreesboro. And he had a gospel show that was on WGNS AM radio and on the UHF TV 27 channel every other afternoon. And Ronnie Stoneman lived in Rutherford County, and she would play banjo on Carl Tipton's show. And he got lots of recognition for that. Well, now listen, old Big Charlie's Bait Shop was a sponsor for the Carl Tipton show. And just so happens that when I ended up in the hospital, about that time, old Bob Latimer had been on his farm and had got kicked in the ribs ferrying a mule, changing the shoes on a mule. He got kicked in the ribs pretty good, and it busted up a bunch of his ribs. So he was in the next bed over. My little doctor that did the knee surgery for me was a little fellow from South Korea. His name was Sung Ho Lee. Sung Ho Lee from South Korea. I don't know where he practices now, but he practiced in South Korea for a good long, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee for a good long while. Anyway, story goes something like this. There ain't too many things that Ole'Pops won't eat, won't drink. Hospitals generally have them a routine. They come through and they wake you up at about 5 o'clock in the morning to get you to pee in a cup. They check your urine. Generally, for a little while, they don't care what you do, and then PT starts. Well, breakfast and then PT, physical therapy starts. Now, this is after your surgery. Well, this Nurse Dietrich, now I called her Nurse Ratched. If y'all remember, in 1975, Jack Nicholson starred in a Stephen King movie called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where Louise Fletcher played a nurse called Nurse Ratched. And because of her bedside manner, I called this Nurse Dietrich, I called her Nurse Ratched. Never to her face. I wasn't that blatant about it. But I was in the hospital that particular time about 6 days. And every day at 5 o'clock in the morning, I'd hear the wheels on that cart come rolling down the floor. And I'd hear clip, clop, clip, clop. You could tell her walk. I mean, it was lumbering, and she was, I mean, I'm not going to describe it. She's, bless her heart, she was old then. She's got to be dead by now. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But anyway, old Malcolm used to, bless his heart, he used to follow her around everywhere she went like a shadow. This guy was a tree. And she'd bring me a thing of apple juice. And back then, they'd bring you a glass, a sterilized glass pea cup. They didn't bring you these little plastic ones now that they do. But back then, it was a sterilized glass pea cup. And I knew they were sterilized. You know, I'd seen the autoclaves. But I asked that woman, anyway, what I was getting about ain't many things that Ole'Pops wouldn't eat. I don't like apple juice. It's odd that I'm smoking an apple tobacco. That's why I'm smoking it, because of this story. But I just don't like apple juice. I just detest it. And I asked her every morning or every afternoon or every time she'd bring it, I asked her, will you bring me something else? And I know the reason why she brought it. I didn't have no trouble peeing. She wanted to bring me something to make my kidneys move. But I asked her, would you bring me something else besides apple juice? But she'd bring me this apple juice every morning. And this woman always spoke in plurals. It was always, how are we? Always in plurals. But anyway, it never failed. Every morning, apple juice in a pea cup. Didn't matter how many times I asked her. All right. The final night that I was there, my doctor came in. I'd been through all the physical therapy that I could be in, you know, that I had done all the exercises that I was supposed to do. He came in and checked me. And he told me the night before, he said, I'll be in at 6 o'clock to sign your records. You may go home. And I said, hallelujah. Well, I guess he neglected to tell anyone at the nurse's station. But I knew I was going home at 6 in the morning. Well, I called my wife, and I told her, come and get me. She turned around and called my dad. My dad had a station wagon. We had a small car. And my dad brought my wife, and they come on up there. And they're standing in the room when this happens. About 5:30, I hear the cart coming down. Well, about 5 o'clock in the morning, I hear the cart down the hall About 5:30, it gets to my room. And here she and Malcolm come through the door. She's got this tray in her hand. She lumbers up to the bed.
How are we this morning?
And I told her, I said, I imagine we're just fine.
Do we know the routine?
We know the routine. And I take the tray from her. She pulls the curtain. Well, while she's got that curtain pulled, I take that little bottle of apple juice and I poured it over into the pea cup, and then I drank the rest of it. I set that apple juice, that pea cup, back down on the tray. And I told her, I said, I'm done. She opens up that curtain. She picks it up and she looks at it. She put her finger, without a rubber glove, she put her finger over the top of it and she shook it. She held it up to the light. She looks at me and she shook it again and she held it up to the light, and almost as if she is offering it to me, she goes,
My, aren't we cloudy this morning?
Without even batting an eye, I take it out of her hand and I say, well, maybe we need to run her through again. And I downed it out of that pea cup. Now, that woman hit the floor like a blind roofer. Just pow! Bob Latimer's in the bed catty-corner to me with the emergency button in his hand going, trying to laugh and cry at the same time from the pain and what I'd just done to that woman. I look over at him. My dad looks over at him and says, Bob, it'll feel better when it quits hurting. Bob starts laughing again. He starts punching that button again. All of a sudden, Malcolm looks down at her. He looks up at me. He's got a look on his face. And I told my dad, I said, Dad, I've had fun, but this ain't it. My wife and my dad helped me over into a wheelchair. About that time, Dr. Sung-Ho Lee comes through the door. He signs off on my paperwork, and he looks down at the floor, and Nurse Dietrich is helping herself, and Malcolm is helping her up, and he says, what's going on here? And I didn't waste time listening for an explanation. I looked up at Malcolm and I said, Malcolm, if you're through chewing the bark off of that tree, buddy, we'll see you in the next life. And me and my dad and my wife made a quick escape out of the room. And I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I didn't wait for an explanation. Now, if y'all will recall back, I explained to you once before where inspiration came from for a songwriter. And I told you that inspiration for me at one point came from the top of a pizza box. A song that I wrote called Nobody Knows from a Domino's ad campaign, and I wrote a song when I read it off their pizza box called "Nobody Knows Like Me." In 1988, I was laying in bed one night, and my dad called me, and he asked me. He said, "Son, what are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing." He said, "Turn the TV on. Turn the TV on, quick." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Put on channel 4. Put on channel 4. Hurry, hurry." And I turned the TV on, channel 4. There sat Alan King, a fine, fine comedian on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, telling that story. And my dad said, "He is telling your story." We had a good laugh over it. I've got the memory of it in my head, and I've got the wonder of it in my head. And it's to me, I don't know if it's pride that I actually feel, but Alan King, he's a hell of a comedian, and he's got one of the most wry. You might even at some point in some of his humor, you might even call it angry sense of humor, but I always enjoyed it. And y'all check out some of his work. But he's a heck of an author. He used to write books, and he's a fine comedian. But he told my story. But anyway, I'm Ole'Pops. Just thought you might like that story. Y'all have a good time. Y'all have a good night.